Welcome to the Your Innovation Coach webinar. Today's topic is Lean Phase Gate, and what I want to do is I'll start off describing phase gate and what a lean version of it might mean. Secondly, and just as importantly, I want to talk about what phase gate is not, and then we'll move into to a sample process. So phase gate has been around for many years. It's a pretty common process that many companies have adopted. It consists of a series of phases from the very beginning, for instance, idea generation, all the way to the back end in terms of product launch. Each phase typically will have some high-level deliverables that we'll talk about here in a minute, and then to move from one phase to the other, the project team will go through gates. Typically, senior management will review the project, review the high-level deliverables that are part of that phase, and then approve moving from one phase to another. This process was really put in place originally as a portfolio management tool to give management an opportunity to look at a collection of projects and make investment decisions at each of these gates. That's really what it's about, is as you move through the development, you're increasing the investment in the project. Typically, the process is documented as part of a quality system, so it might be part of your ISO system or whatever other quality system you might have in place. It's generally illustrated in this way as kind of a linear type of process, but the reality is I like to illustrate it using a vortex, because anyone who's run a project knows that it's just usually not as smooth as it might appear with that graphic on the previous slide. You might be in phase 4 and you experience a design loopback, and you actually might get kicked back up, at least a part of the project might be kicked back up to phase 3, for instance. So you know, there's just not normally in most projects will a project move smoothly from one phase to the other. There can be issues as the project unfolds. So the question becomes, what makes a phase gate process lean? And if you go back to the basic definition of lean, it's creating more value with less resources. So I think, you know, a lean phase gate process is probably in the eye of the beholder. I'm going to line out what I believe are some of the key aspects of what might make a phase gate process lean, and one is a focus on lightweight documentation. I think we tend sometimes to over-document the process, which leads to every project having to be run the same exact way. So I think you really should focus on as lightweight of a documentation as practical in order to accomplish the goal. Second, you know, the deliverables I think are an important aspect, and that's really where you should focus, you know, and think through what those high-level deliverables need to be for your process. Third, and it kind of goes in line with the lightweight documentation, and that is that you really want to give the project manager a lot of leeway to manage the project based on the project risk. So again, if you over-document the process, then you force every project to go through the same process, and that might not be the best way. You might be wasting a lot of time and wasting resources. So this really gets to me the heart of looking at it from a lean standpoint. Kind of go along with that, you really need to focus on differentiating between major and minor projects. Not every project needs to flow through the entire documented process, and I'm going to talk about that here in a little bit. So I think that's an important aspect. And I don't think you should focus on a linear process. I think if you if you don't start the next phase before the previous phase is approved, so to speak, I think you can waste a lot of time, waste a lot of resources. I think there are a lot of occasions when you're developing a product where you need to be overlapping phases, and there's nothing wrong with that. And again, it's going to be dependent on how you document your process and how you think about it within the organization. You can incorporate this concept of Kaizen events. You know, that's from the lean manufacturing world. and many of the things that we're going to talk about as this webinar unfolds, you could approach them as an event. In other words, a one-day or a half-a-day type of event where you get the key players together and you hash out a particular document. For instance, maybe defining the product or a project plan or other types of things that you need to do as the project unfolds. It can work in some cases. I think depending on the complexity of the project, not everything can be done in this fashion. In many cases, I think that sometimes these things have to unfold. It's a process rather than necessarily a single event, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But it is a valuable thing to think about, and where you can incorporate that into your thinking in how you run your phase gate process. And then finally, you know, there's definitely the opportunity to integrate the Lean project management tool for task management that we talked about in the last webinar on risk management. And so that's another good way to implement some of the Lean thinking within your phase gate process. All right, let's talk about what phase gate is not. I think that one of the most important things is the fact that just having a formal documented phase gate process does not guarantee project success. I think a lot of companies will put various processes in place and believe that that's going to be the answer to all your problems, and it's not. It's no guarantee that every project will be successful just because you have one of these kind of processes in place, so you need to keep that in mind. Secondly, because it's typically a documented process, you need to be careful and aware of organization inertia. Once these processes get in place, it's very difficult to change them. It's just human nature within our organizations, and the larger the organization, the more difficult it is. Again, it gets back, I think, to focusing on lightweight documentation rather than over-documenting something. Third, and I think maybe this is probably the most important point to remember, if you don't remember anything else from this webinar, is that PhaseGate is a project governance tool. It's really meant to give senior management the opportunity to look at a portfolio of projects, but it's not a project management technique. It does not inform the project manager what tools they need to use to manage the project. In the last couple webinars, you know, we've talked a lot about project management tools, and that's really based on project risk. So again, with how you document the PhaseGate process, you need to give that project manager a lot of latitude on the tools that they use to manage the project. And I think that's why sometimes people get to blame you know, the lack of success within projects on PhaseGate rather than on where it should lie, and that is within the project management tools that are being used to run the various projects. Not every project is the same, and it requires, you know, very context-specific tools to make sure that the project runs smoothly within the context, within the framework of PhaseGate. And I think that's a good way to think about PhaseGate. It's really a framework that all your projects run within, kind of driven by these high-level deliverables. Fourth is this battle between process versus vision. In other words, where does value get created for customers? Is it processes that you put in place that are important for creating value, or is vision, creativity, and so forth more important in creating customer value? And the fact is that both are important, and you have to do both really well. I think established organizations get very process focused, and that's just natural over time. Startups tend to emphasize vision. You know, if you think of the Steve Jobs of the world and so forth, that's kind of the concept of a visionary company. And that's important, and startups, you know, are very good at that, but the fact is that if a startup never puts in any process, they will never move from a startup to an actual ongoing enterprise. And the same with an established company. If you are 100% focused on process and forget the role of vision and creativity and serendipity and all those types of things, then you will miss opportunities to create customer value. So you have to be able to do both very, very well. Today, really, we're going to be talking a lot about process, but you can't forget vision in creating customer value. And finally, there's this concept of get fat fast, and what that means is that PhaseGate emphasizes incremental investment in the project. So you start with low investment, and as you go through the gates, basically senior management is making an increasing investment in the project. But there is data that suggests that, especially for higher uncertainty projects where you might have a lot of uncertainty, unknown unknowns and so forth, increasing the investment, particularly in terms of resources at the beginning of the project, may lead to more successful new projects, new products. So you need to think about that. The higher the uncertainty in the project, you might want to invest more heavily at the beginning of the process versus at the back end. Typically at the back end, what happens is the project is late. Senior management typically wants to put a lot of resources in the project really at a time when it really is not going to help get the product to market any faster. Actually, it can hurt more than it can help. Okay, we're going to go through now a sample process, and what I'm going to describe to you today is a 6-phase process. There's nothing magical about that. These processes can be very adaptable to your particular technology, to your company, to your culture and history and so forth. But pretty much every PhaseGate system will have, incorporate some aspect of the concepts that we're going to talk about in each of these phases. But before I go through the process, I want to touch on 6 kind of overarching topics that relate to the PhaseGate process. And one is thinking about how projects are managed. And typically this is going to be something that's going to be part and parcel of the documented process. Typically you'll have a project leader. That's usually going to come from engineering or manufacturing, depending on the type of project. This is the person that's going to be primarily responsible for managing that project, picking the right project management tools, and communicating progress. Within PhaseGate, I think it's important to have this concept of the core team. The core team leader usually is the same project leader. It doesn't have to be. The core team will have representatives from all the major functional areas, for instance, engineering and manufacturing and maybe marketing or sales, the product manager and so forth. It's really this virtual team that comes and goes based on the projects that assists the project leader in making really all the strategic decisions on the project and then going back and coordinating activities within their functional area. So there might be a marketing representative on that team, and then they're going to go back based on high-level strategic decisions that happen in the core team and coordinate those activities within their functional group. Typically, you're going to have maybe weekly or monthly core team meetings, depends on the project. It might change over the course of the project. And again, these are more strategic in nature. They're really overarching guidance for the various project teams. And then you get down to the project team level. There might be a project team for engineering, there a project team for the manufacturing organization, so there might be multiple project teams. These are the individual contributors to the project. Of course, that can change based on the needs of the project. There might be some people that are temporary and come in and out of the project as the needs arise. And really within the project team, you can use the concept of this lean project management tool that we talked about in the last webinar, which focuses on stand-up meetings and the visual project board for really the task and the workflow management. So it's really at the project team level and that lean tool that you're going to be focused on task management. And the core team meetings really shouldn't be really task oriented. They really should be more focused on strategic type direction. Secondly is the concept of the product committee. Again, this should be something that's part and parcel of your PhaseGate process. You can call it different things. I call it a product committee. This committee is typically going to be chaired at with either the president or the owner or the senior manager really who's responsible for the P&L for that business. So it really requires a high level engagement, and you know, that level of person should be involved and involved with this particular committee. And that committee will include other senior managers within the organization, from engineering and operations and sales and marketing, finance. So it's a high-level management committee, and that's appropriate because we're talking about new product development, which is, if not one, it may be the most important of all the processes within the business. So it's very important that it's you know, that senior management is engaged in the process. This committee is going to meet on some regular basis based on the needs of the business, maybe monthly, maybe quarterly, depends on the business. And that committee really is charged with making all product related decisions within the business. That includes issues with existing products. So it's a great forum for talking about, for instance, quality problems or other issues with existing products. That committee is going to make all the decisions on new products or platforms. It could also be the team that's responsible if maybe you're looking at an overall change in the entire platform strategy, or implementing road mapping, looking at future technologies, or maybe developing a whole new business model. So this is the virtual team that could manage all that. And then finally, they would oversee what I would term the portfolio process. This is really about looking at the collection of projects that you've got going right now in concert with looking at other opportunities that might come about. And we're going to talk about that in a future webinar. So this is a very important task, or very important activities that need to go on within the business, and I think you know, within the context of the product committee, it's a good way to do that. And then of course this is the committee that will approve moving from one stage to another in each of the projects within your stage gate or phase gate process. Right, the third construct that I want to talk about is the concept of a product manager. And I think it's a very important resource within the business. It's being done in some way in your business now. It might not be called a product manager. If it's a small enough business, it might be the owner or the president of the company. But this is the person that has one foot in the engineering world, so to speak, and one foot in the sales and marketing world. There are different reporting structure options. If it is a separate function, if you do have a product manager, you know, I don't particularly like that person reporting through the engineering organization any more than I like that person reporting through to the sales organization. They probably should report to the senior manager in the business, be independent, so to speak, because they will be negotiating a lot of things between sales and marketing and manufacturing and engineering. They are responsible for a number of different things. They're going to be involved with every project and core team within their realm of responsibility for products. They would drive the process of what I call the new product proposal, or NPP, or you can call it what you want. This is a marketing document. I'm going to talk about that in a minute here, but they are responsible for driving that process. And they would provide, through the development of a product, the so-called voice of the customer to the project team. So there are a lot of things that come up as a product gets developed, and this person would need to go back to the organization in order to get input, and go back to customers to get input to the project teams. And then at the back end of the project, they would be the person that's responsible for introducing that product to the market, working with the sales organization, the marketing collateral that needs to get developed, all that kind of stuff that needs to happen to get the product out to market. And sometimes this person could actually function as a product champion. If you're implementing a really radical, new to the world type of product, or maybe even implementing a brand new business model, you might need someone in addition to the project manager to help shepherd that project through the process. You know, if it's a radical departure to what you're doing now, it might, be subject to what I would call corporate antibodies, where that would attack that project from a resource standpoint to keep it from impinging on their, on profitability of an existing business model or existing products. So this might be important when you're bringing some new products into your company and into the market. Fourth is the concept of major project versus smaller projects, and I mentioned that towards the beginning. Major projects, and this is very subjective in terms of what's major and what's minor. You have to decide that within your business. But a major project, you could run using the full process with product committee approval at each stage. But smaller projects, you might not go through every step. You might start with a marketing document, a new product proposal that's going to actually function as a project plan, go through the development, and then go back to the product committee to get approval for shipment, or AFS in my terminology here. So that's a two-step process. You're not going to go to the product committee to get every approval for every phase that you go through. And then you might have some minor accessories that might not even have a marketing document or an MPP, but will simply be released to manufacturing versus your normal ECO type process. So you need to think about that, again, and how you document your process, and give the engineering manager and maybe the project managers or whoever a lot of latitude in making that decision. Fifth is the concept of integrating software development within PhaseGate. The bottom line is the PhaseGate development processes were, emphasize physical products, but software has become obviously a lot more important. And to some degree, software projects might be better managed using Agile and Scrum. You can still fit them within the context of the framework of PhaseGate, but you have to, again, depending on how you document the process, if you have a software-only project, you might want to modify, how the project is run through those gates. There's a couple scenarios. You might have a hardware project with a substantial software component, or a software-only project. So again, you need to think about that in the context of your projects and how you might want to, integrate that into your thinking in terms of PhaseGate. And finally, before we go through the process, there's a relationship between PhaseGate and portfolio management. The next webinar will focus on portfolio management, which is really the process that you go through to look at your current projects in light of other opportunities that might come about, and decide, how are you deciding which projects you're going to work on? And out of that process flows the projects that go into PhaseGate and actually get developed. But the fact is that, especially at the very beginning of PhaseGate, there's a lot of interplay between PhaseGate, the projects that are in your PhaseGate process, and the portfolio management process. That's the implication of the double-headed arrow. So you might learn something at the beginning of a project that kicks it back, and it might get reprioritized. The project might be put on hold. It might be killed. It might be reprioritized. So there's a lot of give and take here in terms of its interaction with portfolio management. Today we're really going to focus on this process. Okay, so with that extended introduction on some important topics that relate to the process, I want to now go into and describe each of these phases, what's important, I think, to think about. But before we do that, I do want to mention a couple things that, the phase checklist are a very important part of PhaseGate, and you need to think through these high-level deliverables, because they're really going to, in essence, especially at the beginning of the project, kind of drive the overall schedule and things that you have to make sure that you accommodate in the development. And each phase will have its own set of deliverables. For instance, here in the engineering phase, it's going to be focusing on developing prototypes and doing the actual design effort. So there'll be prototype deliverables, there'll be design review deliverables, et cetera, et cetera. But it will extend to things like regulatory approval, as a deliverable, finalizing the cost of the product as a deliverable. So all these things are really high-level deliverables that really will drive the tasks within the development. The second thing I'll point out is, as I go through this, you're going to notice that I really emphasize spending a lot of time on these first couple phases, because I think sometimes we tend to want to jump right into engineering of a product before we really do our due diligence and get ourselves set up for success. So I really want to emphasize that concept of making sure that you do the upfront work that you need. The more upfront work you do here, the smoother it's going to go at the back end. And I even mentioned this in the concept of resources. Sometimes we shortchange our resources here, maybe because people are working at other projects and can't actually focus on a new project, but investing more heavily up at the front end can help you at the back end. So let's go through this. We'll start with phase one, what I call the scouting phase. So within the portfolio management process, we've come up with a project that we want to work on. We've now decided in the business that it's going to enter the phase gate process, and it's going to enter what I call phase one. Phase one, or a scouting phase, starts with what I would consider a draft new product proposal. And this might be a single-page document that would have flowed out of the portfolio management process. And the output is a final new product proposal. And these documents are the same, except that the final one is more refined. So during this process, engineering might start scouting some technologies, maybe doing some high-level block diagrams, some basic design work, and then the product manager is going to continue to develop that NPP and move it from a draft version to a final version. So really, in my world view, so to speak, this phase one is really all about defining the product. But it's a process. Now, I mentioned, you could potentially do this in the context of a Kaizen type event, but realistically, if it's a relatively complex development, it's really going to be a process of definition, not just getting around a conference room table and finalizing the definition. Though that might work with some products. Let's talk about this new product proposal, which is a very important part of this phase one. And of course, before moving to phase two, the product committee will officially make a go or no-go decision on the project. But as I mentioned, let's talk about this marketing document, or the new product proposal. First of all, it's important to know what it's not. I think at this stage of the game in most projects, there is a temptation in this marketing document to define when you're going to come to market with this product. And I think in a lot of cases that's a mistake, because if it's got the project has a relatively high level of uncertainty, until you actually build a prototype, until you really know what you got and what you need to develop and what the risks are, trying to decide when you're going to come to market with that, it can set the organization up for failure. The project team will be set up for failure, and senior management will be disappointed when the project doesn't come to market as expected. And unfortunately, a lot of times dates get cast in stone at this point, and maybe because of a trade show or some external deadline and so forth, and you have to be very cautious of defining the end game depending on the risk within the project. Secondly, I typically like the product manager to be responsible for the process of developing this document. Again, unless you're going to do it in an event type of format, on a single day type of thing, it's a process, and the product manager, I think, is the right person to drive that process to conclusion. Doesn't mean they're going to write the entire thing, in isolation in their office, but they need to drive the process. And there are some really key elements of this document. You need to have some background. Why is it that you want to develop this product? What's the competitive landscape? What's the need for this product? What's the vision for this product? That's really what the background section is about. Roughly describing what the product is. What you don't want to do is hamstring the engineering organization. You want to give them a lot of latitude for developing the design, but what is the key functional aspects of this product? You might even have some basic, very important specifications, maybe written in terminology associated with, this is the bare minimum that we can accept, and this is the desirable in terms of key, specifications for the product. You might have, as part of this, maybe key quality aspects or whatever. So that's part and parcel of the product description. How the product is going to be used and how it might be validated in terms of how the customer is going to use it. Thinking about the risks, the schedule risk, the technical risk, the business risk. We talked a lot about risk management in the previous webinars, and this is where that's going to start in terms of kind of identifying some of those key risks. Now that's going to carry over into phase 2, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Some kind of basic financial analysis. It's not, it's very appropriate here to do a basic financial model where you're looking at volumes and what the cost structure needs to be, and margin requirements, and net present value calculations, and so on and so forth. So it's very important to do that type of work as part of this document. And then lining out some of the key resources that you need to get to really the end of phase 2. I like this document to line out the major milestones to the end of phase 2, not to the end of the project, because again, it gets back to this concept that it's not a project schedule, but you do want to try to define a schedule at least to get to the end of phase 2, where you got a good definition, you got a project plan, you know what you have to develop, and a lot of the high-level uncertainty has been reduced to a manageable level. So that's really the idea here. Again, in my view, developing this product definition, it's not necessarily a singular event. You're going to define a product, you're going to sit down with folks, you're going to evaluate that definition, you're going to be meeting with all the stakeholders, you're going to go around the loop multiple times. It might take multiple iterations of this document to get to a agreed upon definition of what you're going to develop. And it really sits inside of this, or between the portfolio process and your phase gate process. So there's a lot of interplay, because as I mentioned before, this is really part of the fuzzy front end, so to speak, and so you might learn something as you start to define this product in phase 1. It kicks it back into the portfolio process, and maybe the project gets put on hold. So, again, it's not a singular event, but a process. Okay, so phase 1 is really product definition. Phase 2, now, the input to that is that definition document, that marketing document, and the output typically is, this is where you're going to build a prototype, the first functional prototype. You're going to develop what I call a project plan, and the first draft of what I call the product design specifications, or PDS, and we'll talk about these two different documents in a minute. And during this phase, basically engineering is going to be building a functional integrated prototype, kind of in concert with some basic design activities, obviously. But the whole goal, the deliverable here is an integrated prototype, and all the tasks, the design tasks that you're going to have to do in order to get to that point. And then product management is going to continue to develop that definition. That new product proposal continues to morph and change. It's going to turn into a project plan here in a minute, but the product manager is going to continue to, to build the business case for that project. And then again, before moving to phase 3, the product committee is going to make a go or no-go decision. So now let's talk about these two documents, the project plan and the first draft of the product PDS document. Before I move to that point, though, one other final point, and that is, it's really at the end of phase 2, in my mind, that the project team commits to the timing for the project, to the schedule. So, and then from this point forward, that project plan is going to supersede the new product proposal and really guides the project from the end of phase 2 until you get to the market. So as I mentioned before, the NPP, the new product proposal, really should not define the end game, so to speak, the schedule. It's really through phase 1 and phase 2, and then at the end of phase 2, the project plan now defines how you're going to get to market. All right, so now let's come back to the project plan. Again, like the new product proposal, a project plan is going to have multiple elements. And while you might be able to do this within the context of a Kaizen event, more than likely there are going to be multiple events that are going to play into developing this plan. And again, the piece of paper is not as important as the process that you go through to get to that point. This is really about building understanding within the project team and within the business. So again, the project plan is going to have multiple different sections. Obviously, there's going to be a project definition and definition of high-level deliverables. So again, your phase gate will have high-level deliverables, but they may get changed, added to, subtracted to, so to speak. So again, you need to write your document in a way that your phase gate process in a way that gives the project manager latitude in coming up with those deliverables for that particular project. You're going to have a section for kind of the master schedule and cost objectives. This is going to be a high-level schedule, really, with key milestones to get from the end of phase 2 into the market. And we're going to come back and talk about that here in a minute. You're probably going to line out some key personnel, lead personnel, and so forth, define project teams and so forth. You're going to be looking at, again, continuing to build the case from a financial impact standpoint, refining your financial model. Again, continuing on with looking at applications and how the product will be validated in terms of meeting customer needs. And then a really key activity will be the risk identification and mitigation. And this goes back to the last couple webinars when we talked about all the tools that are available for doing this. So you're going to want to ferret out foreseeable uncertainty, and using things like risk lists and FMEA are going to be used there to look at foreseeable uncertainty. And out of these activities will flow knowledge gaps where you might be faced with unforeseeable uncertainty or unknown unknowns, where you want to focus on learning cycles or parallel trials in order to close those knowledge gaps. So these are key things that are going to happen in phase 2 that are going to drive a lot of the tasks that are going to fill out the granularity of the schedule. But this is a really key activity, and there are going to be multiple things that are going to happen there, to understand the risks within the project. And then you might have some other sections in terms of open issues and revision history as this project plan carries on through the rest of the project. So let's talk about a couple things here. Within the context of the project definition, I think one activity that will happen, and this will drive a lot of the tasks associated with building that first prototype, will be the concept of developing a block diagram or looking at your product as a system. So system architecture is very important, and I mentioned that in previous webinars, and that's an activity that's got to get done in the context of the describing the product and thinking about how you're going to engineer it and how you're going to develop that first prototype. But system architecture is very important, and it should be elevated within the project team. Decisions that you make on the architecture will carry all the way through to the end, and you're going to live with those decisions. Architecture is very difficult to change as the project starts to unfold. So you need to take a lot of time and think about your system. You're going to start up at the system requirements, but ultimately you got to get down to the individual module level, how they're going to interact with one another, how you're going to allocate common components across the different modules, where particular functions are going to occur. So this is a very important activity, and we could spend maybe a whole webinar talking about system architecture issues. Secondly, another really key task within the development of the project plan is the high-level schedule. And so, it's very common now at this stage of the process or this stage of the development within phase 2 to come up with a high-level schedule. And this is going to be driven by those high-level deliverables as well as the task or the key things that come out from your risk mitigation activities. All that's going to flow into kind of the big picture. And you can do this in the context of a Gantt chart or simply on a on a spreadsheet or on a big project board. But the idea is you're going to key in on the key milestones and some time frame in terms of getting there. So for instance, you've got a key deliverable of a design approval. Well, those are design tasks, and in this case, the team estimated about 5 weeks to get to that point. So you can start building a high-level schedule based on the key deliverables to get you from point A to point B. The red indicates the critical path, and then from that activity, you're gonna come up with the high-level deliverable or high-level schedule and how long it's going to take you to get to market. So really, it's at this stage of the game within phase 2 that you're going to develop this type of schedule, which will lead to the commitment on the project team standpoint in order to get to market. Of course, a lot of things are going to get flushed out as you start developing the product, but you got to start somewhere with this high-level schedule. And really, I go back to this slide that I used in the previous webinars related to risk management. Really, everything we're talking about is associated with, in phase 2, is this project planning activity. Right, the development of your basic block diagram, which flows into the high-level schedule. You're starting to do, look at your risks and understanding the risk list and using FMEA and so forth. All that's going to feed back into the schedule. That's going to flow into trying to ferret out these unknown unknowns, and maybe you've got to experiment and do some learning trials or learning cycles in order to figure out what you don't know, and all that's going to kind of feed into the schedule. And out of that will flow the actual tasks, and this is where you can use the Lean tool that we talked about in the previous webinar as a way to manage the actual tasks. So really, everything that we're doing within developing this project plan, which is really a process, is all all part and parcel of figuring out what tasks you have to do, and then using a tool such as that Lean tool in order to manage those tasks. The second kind of document that's part of the phase 2 is what I term the product design specifications. This is really an engineering document. It's going to get revision control just like every other drawing within the development. So it's written in technical terms. It's got technical specifications, and out of that will flow how manufacturing is going to need to test the product. So that's why it's very important to spend time on this document and have it as part of your phase gate process, because it's a good way to, from the very beginning of the project, to start thinking about the technical specifications, how you're going to test for it, and which of those you're going to actually test in manufacturing. Typically, this is a document that's going to be driven by the engineering manager. It's not a marketing document. The product engineering manager is typically, or the project manager is typically going to develop that as he or she will for the project plan as well. Now, I want to point out an important caveat to the discussion about phase 1 and phase 2, and that is what I just described works really well for incremental projects. An existing product that you might be incrementally changing. Maybe you're changing just one aspect of it. These are projects that are, it's usually much easier to define that new product proposal. And the process that I just described for phase 1 and phase 2 works really, really well. But you have to think about, if you're developing a more radical product, maybe something brand new to your company or new to the market, or maybe a brand new business model, this, you may not even know what the customer wants. So trying to sit down and develop a marketing document might be a waste of time. And so you might really be in phase 1 and phase 2 focusing on this concept of using the learning cycles or parallel trials in order to to figure out what exactly you need to develop. So that's really the whole basis of the lean startup movement, the concept of the minimal viable product, to get something out, to test it with customers. So, you got to think about that. And again, depending on how you approach defining your phase gate process, you need to give the project team a lot of latitude that, in this type of a project, you might run phase 1 and phase 2 completely different than you will for an incremental project. So you need to have maintain flexibility and not try to do this type of a project with this type of a process. And it's really out of this type of activity where you're iterating and learning. At some point you can then define what the customer wants and move on through the development, but you don't want to jump right to a product definition when you don't even know what the customer wants. And as I mentioned, this can also be applied if you're developing a brand new business model. Okay, phase 3, the engineering phase. Now the input, of course, is your first integrated prototype and the project plan that you've developed and the first draft of the product design specifications. The output is going to be a final design, basically. So all the design tasks are really going to be carried out in this phase 3. If you've done a good job at phase 1 and phase 2, then everyone knows what needs to be developed, and now it's a matter of engineering the product. And then also sufficient documentation. So as part of that design effort, you're going to document the product, and it's really at this phase, when you move from phase 3 to phase 4, that you're moving the documentation into your revision control process. And then you're going to continue to update the project plan and the product design specifications. So during this process, the focus really is the design of the engineering of the product through usually one or multiple cycles of prototypes. And then within each cycle of prototypes, there might be multiple numbers of those prototypes. And actually all of this should be decided as part of phase 2 in developing the project plan. You shouldn't wait wait until you're in phase 3 to decide how many cycles and how many prototypes you're going to build. This is really, in this phase, you're going to look for opportunities to integrate manufacturing into the process. Manufacturing might even actually build the prototypes. Now, this assumes that it's a product development. If this is a process development, say in a chemical company or whatever, then this engineering phase is really about process development, and so it's a little different. But again, you can incorporate that into your thinking in terms of how you define the phase gate process. And of course, there are going to be lots of design reviews with all the stakeholders, and we'll talk about design reviews here in a minute. And then really at this part, in this phase, if it is a manufactured product, then it's also during this phase that manufacturing is going to be looking at the process. Design reviews are very important. Within any development, you are probably going to have multiple formal and informal reviews. In my experience, if you've got a high level of uncertainty in the project, then informal communication is more important in addition to the formal reviews. This might play out in terms of how you organize yourself. For instance, you might want to co-locate the team so that it enhances the concept of informal communication and serendipity. Formal reviews really should be done prior to starting a design cycle, and then at the end, after you've analyzed the results. My experience is you really going into a design review, there should be a published agenda, and then notes should be issued after the fact on any key decisions. I mean, what you don't want to have happen is decisions get made and then you're rehashing the same decision a month later. Design reviews need to include all key stakeholders from the multiple functional groups. You might even include engineers from other projects to have kind of an independent view of the project. And importantly, whoever's giving that review needs to be open to questions from the team and not become defensive. And that's an important task of the project manager, to make sure you set the expectations. Next is phase 4. Phase 4 is really a manufacturing phase. So the input now is a verified design. You've got drawings that have been released to revision control. You've got an updated project plan and product design specifications, and it's really during this process that manufacturing builds maybe one or multiple cycles of manufacturing prototypes. So the focus here is on manufacturing and refining that process. In my experience, it's really in phase 4 where for an engineered product, you might be subject to design loopbacks. It also is going to be dependent on how well you've integrated manufacturing in previous phases. So you have to be on guard for that. And in my experience, this is where a lot of projects bog down in phase 4. The output of this phase is the tested pre-production units, manufacturing units, again, an updated project plan and updated product design spec, and then of course the product committee is going to approve going from phase 4 to the next phase. And that's phase 5. This is what I call an approved for shipment phase. This is really where the first batch of customer units are going to get built. So the input are those tested manufacturing pre-production units, the project plan, the updated project plan, and product design specifications. And the output is what I would call the first AFS build. This is really the first products that are going to ship to customers, or maybe a pilot run if it's a process type of company. And then the other output, I think, should be what I would term an AFS report. An AFS report really should have its own checklist. This is really the final step that the business is going to say, yes, we're ready to go to market. So there'll be different sections for this checklist. For R&D, do you have final patent clearance? You know, have you done an internal safety review with the product? Is everything ready within the system in terms of ECCN numbers and so forth? Manufacturing, you might have a whole separate checklist for manufacturing. Has it been incorporated into the quality system? Do you have MSDS sheets out on the manufacturing floor? All those kind of things. Engineering support, are the manuals already? Customer manuals, have you tested it with all different voltages around the world and so forth? What about software? Is it compatible with all the, the software versions? Service, is service ready to go? Are parts in inventory for accommodating the service? Is the service manual done? All these types of issues. Product management in terms of, is the pricing all in the system so that the sales folks can quote the systems? How are you commercializing it? Is the website ready? All those kind of things. So again, this is all important aspects of getting the product to market. And if you don't have this type of a checklist, sometimes you can forget these things, and then it's too late once you've introduced the product. Okay, so then the final phase might be a phase 6, a post-shipment phase. And in a post-shipment phase, the core team stays in place, and this might not be necessary for all projects. So in that case, if it's not necessary, then the project is done after phase 5. But if phase 6 is necessary, and you might want to do this for your more major projects, higher risk type projects, the core team is going to monitor installation. So they're going to get feedback from customers in the field organization about how the product is performing. You might be ramping up production. You might start off slow and start building in terms of the pipeline and so forth, and taking care of any issues that come up as the product gets installed and used by customers. You might be following up on outstanding issues. You might go to market maybe with maybe there's some manufacturing yield issues that you need to work on. And then of course you might perform a lessons learned audit of the project, and that's of course appropriate in this phase as well as the other phases. So in summary, what I described is a 6-phase process. It's certainly adaptable to your organization, but PhaseGate is a very effective governance tool, but you need to guard against the fact that it's not a project management tool. It's a framework that you're going to run all the projects, and the high-level deliverables are very important, and the structure in terms of developing the project plan and the design reviews and all that kind of stuff is very important. But the specific project management tool that you're going to use, whether it's the Lean tool or a simple Gantt chart or Scrum for software development or other types of tools, are really going to be dependent on the risk of the project at that particular point in time. Secondly, there are certain ways to incorporate lean thinking into the process, particularly in terms of how you document the process and how you give latitude to the project manager in terms of running the individual projects. And that goes to the third point, and that is you need to give the project manager a lot of latitude in how they run and manage the project. And fourthly, it's important to not necessarily focus on the fact that you're just in one phase. It's very typical to be in two phases at one time. You might be 80% in phase 3 and 20% in phase 4. There's nothing wrong with that. The business needs to take prudent risks to keep things moving and to incorporate lean thinking into your process. Okay, I want to thank you for attending this webinar, and there's my contact information. Happy to answer any questions for you offline, and I look forward to your participation with the next webinar. Thanks, and have a great day.